what I want to talk about in the rest of today is something about how we are going to discuss these issues. Can we discuss these issues? What does it really mean to argue about ethics and to discuss questions in ethics? Because I think that most of you, again, unless you've already done a course in ethics in which you looked at what's called meta-ethics, that is the questions about the nature of ethics, unless you've already thought hard about that, done reading about it, or perhaps taken a course about it, there's likely to be a range of different views, perhaps, and perhaps some confusion about how we can discuss ethical issues. So, these are some of the questions that people are likely to ask. Can we reason about ethics? Is there really more to it than simply saying, this is how I feel about this question, and this is about how you feel about the question, and if we feel differently, well, we can express our views, but that's the end of it? I'll be suggesting that there is more than that. I better be, because otherwise this course would not get very far, really. If all we could do was simply state our views, then the discussions that we have, either in this class or in the precepts, would be pretty brief. You know, we could go around the table, we could, in a sense, take a vote on how you feel about this issue, but there wouldn't really be much more to say. But I think there clearly is a lot more to say. And if you look at discussions of these topics, you find quite an extensive literature on them. So people who've studied these things, people with backgrounds in philosophy or people who come to them in other ways, certainly find more to say. And it seems like they're using their reason, that they're reasoning about these topics in some way. Is that really what's going on? Does this mean that we can reach objective judgments? Reach in ethics things that can be true or false in the way that other statements about the world can be true or false? Or are they in some way subjective or relative to the society or culture? Those are the major positions that get staked out here. So let's just have a look at this debate. But before I do, let me just say a little word about the terms we're using here. I generally use the term ethics, it's of course in practical ethics, but you'll all be familiar with the term morality. And for instance, in Rachel's book, the introductory reading talks about morality often. So some people say, well, what's the difference between the two? Do they mean something different? And the answer that I'm going to give for practical purposes in this course is no. You can use them pretty much interchangeably. Some people say, well, there certainly used to be a clear difference between them. So say here, ethics used to be used more for the study of morality, something more scholarly, more serious, not at the popular level, or perhaps for a professional code. Whereas morality was more like the popular judgments that most people would make. But I'm not quite sure why, perhaps because the term morality started to seem kind of rather heavy-handed to people. It seems like there's been a shift towards using ethics more broadly, and so I think it's doubtful if it's worth trying to preserve the distinction. So if you're puzzled about that, just, I think, treat them as more or less equivalent. Sometimes you'll notice, particularly in older texts, the different usage of ethics, but it's not worth keeping with. Okay, so in terms of reasoning, and this is an example of how Rachel's is talking about morality, in terms of reasoning, this is what Rachel's says is the minimum concept of morality, and you can see that there is a role for reasoning in this idea. By the minimum concept, he means a concept that is very widely shared. not universally shared. He does say there are some people who might disagree with elements of this, but he thinks it's a widely shared view of morality, and minimal in the sense that a lot of people would want to add things to this, but most people would not want to subtract from it. So it's about guiding one's conduct by reason, doing what there are the best reasons for doing, and there's a little qualification on that that's important, while giving equal weight, equal consideration to the interests of all of those who are affected by one's decision. So that's a conception of ethics which clearly says it is a matter of reasoning, and in particular a certain kind of reasoning that give equal weight to the interests of all those affected. Well, who would object to that? Who would object to that view of reasoning? Here's a famous philosophical example. A great 18th century philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, one of the greatest philosophers to have written in the English language philosophy. And he was very much a skeptic about the role of practical reason. That is, the role of reason in leading us to act, in guiding our actions. So skeptical, in fact, that, as he says here, reason not only is, but ought to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any office other than to serve and obey them. So what does he mean by that? Well, firstly, by passions, he doesn't necessarily mean what we might mean, where we would think of very strong feelings that you have. You know, when you say people acted in a passion, we might think that they acted impulsively, they were driven by some very strong desire, whatever that might be. In the 18th century use, there are calmer passions as well as more strong, heated passions. So Hume does distinguish between calm passions and others. So, for example, I guess what we think of something like sexual desire maybe as a hot passion. But Hume would use the term also for sitting down and thinking out what your long-term interests might be. So that, you know, if you sat down and thought about what do I want to do when I've finished, when I've graduated, which in fact is another topic that we're going to be discussing at some point in this course. What is an ethical career choice? But if you think about that and you say, well, you know, I would like to practice medicine, or I would like to be a lawyer, or I would like to go into business, or I would like to travel. Hume, they would count as passions for Hume. They would count as desires that you have. So you could read the term passions here as simply kind of any desire that you might have, whether it's one that you feel very strongly and intensely right at this moment, or whether it's something that you're thinking quite calmly, but it's something that you want in some basic way. So Hume is saying reason serves those passions or desires. And this has in fact become quite a widely accepted view of reason in some fields. Particularly if some of you no doubt will be doing courses in economics. Economists would typically say that reason is instrumental. Reason tells you how to get what you want, but you start with something wanted. And reason can't tell us what to want in some basic way. I mean, it can tell you that if you're thirsty, then you want to be somewhere where there's water. Obviously, it can tell you that, but it can't tell you whether to be thirsty or not. And about that kind of passion or desire, maybe that's right. But so on this view, reason is only instrumental, and it may in fact seem to you that that's just the common sense view, that that's clearly true, that reason acts in accordance with your wants. I'll present you with an alternative to that before I finish. But that's the kind of view that Hume is defending. And then Hume's great philosophical opponent in the philosophical tradition is Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest of the German philosophical tradition, who thought that the moral law is something we know by reason. So in this rather dramatic quote, he sees just as the stars above us are something that is objective, that is external to us, but is there and we cannot help appreciating on a clear night if we look up at them. So when we, if you like, look inside, the moral law is something which we also cannot help appreciating or understanding. And that's because it's something that, because we have the capacity to reason, and the moral law is a law of reason. You might say, well, compared to Hume, who gave us a fairly common sense sort of idea here, this is a bit mysterious. What is this moral law that we're supposed to all know by reason? And if we do, why is it that we disagree about a lot of ethical issues? There seem to be some puzzles with this view. Well, here's a contemporary philosopher who we're going to be referring to a few times in this course. Derek Parfit has been a philosopher at Oxford University, just retired from a position there. He's suggesting here that while we may not yet have got agreement on objective moral truths, it's not irrational to hope that we will. So he sees what we're doing in this course, that is, doing ethics and in particular he says non-religious ethics, that is ethics that does not presuppose particular religious beliefs. And of course in this course we're not presupposing any particular religious beliefs. I will say a little bit more about the relationship between religion and ethics soon, but that this is still a relatively new activity. Hasn't been going on for many centuries anyway, so still at a relatively early stage, he thinks. And so we can't yet predict whether we'll reach agreement as we do on at least some mathematical truths. So Parfit's view, if you like, is on the side that it's reasonable to hope that we will reach agreement, that we will be able to agree eventually on objective truths in ethics. And his work is something that is intended to show that. I'll be giving you some glimpses of that work, but it's too much for us to study in this course. We'd never get to the applied practical part of it.